Shabbat Shalom, everybody. Our bar mitzvah for this weekend, Quinn, was allocated one of the most difficult parts of the entire Torah to read and on which to base his sermon for tomorrow. This week's section, Tazria, is a list of medical instructions for how to socially distance when you have a contagious disease. Until only a few years ago, this section of Torah was considered among the most dreaded for a bar mitzvah. Some congregations chose to skip this portion entirely because Tazria was seen as unrelatable, inaccessible, unfair, and disgusting. That was, of course, until January of 2020. And after the pandemic, as Quinn will speak about tomorrow, this text became one of the most relevant in the entire Torah. Years ago, I heard a colleague say that synagogue should be a place that makes you happy and keeps you entertained. Since that day, I've wondered about the role that religion plays in our culture and how our entertainment-driven American society influences our Judaism. Many of our favorite stories, the ones that we tell ourselves and we tell our children over and over, are based on fairy tales. But we find that the dark and challenging parts of those fairy tales are often removed, and the ending is changed to happily ever after. I was surprised to learn as an adult that the fairy tales I'd grown up with did in fact originally contain some fairly dark, violent, and fearful imagery, discussions of disease, and all kinds of things that could go wrong in people's lives. Because, you see, these tales were intended to teach children about both the joys and the dangers of being alive. Stories are, at their core, a teaching tool. And we have to ask ourselves, if we edit the stories that we are telling, are we still teaching our children about the real world? Let's take, for example, a recently remade classic, The Little Mermaid. Did some of you see the remake of how many people saw? How many people saw the non-remake, the animated one from 92, whenever it was? Well, the original text, how many of you have ever read the original Little Mermaid? Yeah. In the original text by Hans Christian Andersen, merfolk, that's mermen and merladies, I guess, merfolk don't have a soul. And they live for 300 years. When they die, there's no afterlife for mer people. They just dissolve, poof, into thin water. In the original Little Mermaid, there are similarities to the version that I grew up watching. In the original Little Mermaid, the mermaid does in fact save the prince from drowning, like in the movie. And she visits the sea witch, like in the movie. And she trades her mer-lady tail for legs, like in the movie. And the prince falls in love with her, like in the movie. However, from here forward, the original story and the movie continue somewhat differently. They have different endings, and they teach us very different lessons. All the stories that we tell, especially the ones we repeat over and over, like the Torah behind me here, that we read every year over and over and over and over again, they are supposed to teach us how to live these stories. They're supposed to teach us how to be humans in the world. That's before school, you taught your children with stories. In Hebrew, a story is called a mashal, and the moral of the story is called a nimshal. We must always ask ourselves when telling or listening to a story, what is the nimshal? What is the moral? If we focus entirely on positive texts and stories that end only happily, and in life-affirming ways, we fail to acquire the tools to deal with the full range of the human experience. Judaism, perhaps especially Judaism, does not believe that every story has a happy ending. And in fact, most of our stories don't have a happy ending. Moreover, the Torah contains, as we will hear about tomorrow from Quinn, lots of stories that are disturbing and problematic and sometimes gross, weird. But over the past 100 years or so, we've started skipping the challenging parts. We've started not reading the bits that make us uncomfortable. Because there's been this push for religion to make us feel good about ourselves all the time. And we also do this because of a relatively new idea in the world that children should be sheltered from anything that might be upsetting. The Torah does not shelter us from upsetting stories. It contains humanity at our best and humanity at our worst. It contains stories about murder and mating and enslavement. And Pirkei Avot, a collection of Jewish wisdom, states that it is entirely appropriate to begin teaching the entirety of the Torah to children as young as age. Does anyone want to guess? Before 13. 13 is when you chayav the mitzvot, when you become a bar mitzvah. Age 5. The idea of childhood as we know it, as a phase of innocence, began only a couple of 100 years ago during the Victorian period. Our present-day belief that children need to be sheltered began with what were called the Victorian child savers. Thomas Jordan argues in his book that children's literature as we know it today began 150 years ago as society shifted away from children's stories like the Grimm's fairy tales, and which taught harsh but important lessons, and towards stories that were light and humorous in order to develop a child's imagination as the highest of all virtues. But all we need to do is look at the stories of Hans Christian Andersen and Andrew and Nora Lang, or the Brothers Grimm, or the Torah to experience a totally different notion of what's appropriate to talk to children about. The nimshal, the moral of these stories, are things like, do not automatically trust strangers, like in Little Red Riding Hood. Do not make arrangements and agreements you cannot keep, like in Rumpelstiltskin. And do not enter suspicious cabins in the woods, like in Hansel and Gretel. I ask you, would these stories be as instructive to children if they all had happy endings? Let's return to The Little Mermaid. In the original story, Ariel does not marry the prince. The prince's parents, the king and queen, decree that the prince must marry a human princess to cement an alliance, as I recall, that they have chosen in an arranged marriage. Heartbroken, the Little Mermaid decides to sneak into the prince's bedroom at night and stab him to death using the dagger that she had acquired from Ursula the Sea Witch. At the last possible moment, when she sneaks into the room, very much like the Akedah story, where Abraham almost sacrifices Isaac. Thank you. I want to make sure you're awake. She raises the dagger, and at the last moment, she has a moment of change of conscience, and she throws the dagger away in a moment of making a moral decision. But she does not get to marry the prince. And as our story draws towards a close, Ariel is forced to board the wedding barge, where she is to watch her beloved prince marry the human princess. She is so heartbroken that she decides to throw herself off the side of the boat into the ocean, and still being a human, she does not revert to being a mermaid, and she drowns. However, since she had controlled her impulse for cruelty and revenge, you remember I mentioned merfolk don't have souls? She is rewarded with a soul which ascends to heaven. This story is less entertaining and optimistic than the movie version I grew up with. But in the 17th century, the philosopher Blaise Pascal said that entertainment is what we humans do to avoid thinking about the difficult parts of life. And today we live in a culture that reduces almost everything to entertainment, even religion. So we must ask ourselves, when we hear a story, what is the nimshal? What are we supposed to gain from hearing a story? And does this message, this moral, line up with what we know about the world? And if we believe the moral of the story we've just heard, how does that influence how we live our lives in the day-to-day? The nimshal of the movie version of The Little Mermaid is just have faith, everything will turn out great. You get to marry the prince, everything's cool. But the nimshal of the original version, which was supposed to be for children, was children have an impulse to be cruel and vengeful if they don't get what they want. And even if you feel like being vengeful, in order to live in a good and well-ordered society, you must learn to overcome your desire for revenge, to smack your sibling, right? You must overcome that urge, even if you're upset or sad. And even though our lives don't automatically have a happy ending, we cannot selfishly murder the prince if we want to. We cannot selfishly treat our siblings with disregard for their feelings, our co-workers, our colleagues, our spouses with disregard. We should not be vengeful even if we do not have our way all the time. That's a very different moral. Is someone shaking their head? No, we should be vengeful and have our way all the time. Is that what I'm seeing? Did I see that somewhere? Shaking your head because of the sibling rivalry. The poet Shel Silverstein, anyone remember Shel Silverstein, a few of you? Gives us an example of the tendency of children to be selfish, the thing that the Little Mermaid teaches us to overcome. And the Parsha, the Torah portion that Quinn will be talking about tomorrow, teaches us to overcome. In his famous poem, The Prayer of the Selfish Child, goes like this. Now I lay me down to sleep. I pray the Lord my soul to keep. And if I die before I wake, I pray the Lord my toys to break, so none of the other kids can use them. Amen. Thus, as we're learning now, children's fairy tales and stories that we teach to children as moral lessons, with exclusively happy endings, have limitations as educational tools. They don't speak to the totality of the human existence. I ask you to imagine a Pixar summer blockbuster called Little COVID. The story of a cheerful little virus with moxie, out to make the world a better place with lots of musical numbers, where little COVID dances around and learns a lesson at the end that little COVID shouldn't make people sick after all. Is that believable? I think not. Not after what we experienced over the past several years. So too, in our religious life, in Judaism, if we skip or change the meanings of the stories that we tell ourselves, if we skip the parts of the Torah that make us squirm, it's no longer religion, it's entertainment. And it becomes useless. In the Torah, in Tazria, human beings with diseases look out for each other and each other's well-being. They can't be vengeful, they can't be greedy, they can't be spiteful. And if they get sick, they have to distance themselves. They have to quarantine themselves away from everyone else in order to not get everyone else sick. Even if they'd like to hug their families. And we can all remember in the recent past when we had to engage in uncomfortable behaviors, like wearing masks that we may not have wanted to wear, or distancing ourselves, which we may not have wanted to do, because even if we were healthy, we might give COVID to someone who wasn't healthy and they might die. And so in order to live in a well-ordered society, we had to set aside our vengeful urges, our selfish urges, our greedy urges, and look out for the people around us. But we can remember during this period people who were acting selfishly indeed. Now, I'm a millennial, I'm 39. Quinn's generation, more than my generation, more than Gen Z, more than you're Gen Alpha, right? You're Gen Z? More than millennials, more than Gen X, more than baby boomers have experienced a global catastrophe during your youth and fear more of these on the horizon. The optimism of the post-World War II period when Americans could afford to live in a world of unending optimism embodied by Star Trek The Next Generation and other shows from the 90s and 2000s, that world, a world of entertainment and continual optimism, has been called into question. For those of us over 18, it's been shaken by the pandemic, January 6th and the war in Ukraine, and most recently, October 7th and the pursuant war. Many of us were raised with the idea that these sorts of stories were behind us, and because of that, we could live only in a world where we told each other happy stories that ended happily ever after, because that was the future of humanity. Ever upward, ever forward, a world of continual progress with happy endings for everyone. But despite the lessons learned by the silent generation, the parents of the baby boomers, the grandparents of the Gen Xers and millennials, we have learned that the technological progress and social acceptance of Jews in the world has not made us invincible or 100% safe. We've learned that humanity can indeed be cruel and nature can be capricious, and we have to leave the rose-colored glasses behind us. And so we can no longer afford to skip Tazria or Metzora or the other parshas that make us uncomfortable. We can no longer afford to strip our children's stories of their ickiness. The Brothers Grimm and the stories like the original Little Mermaid, we can no longer afford to do that because we live in a world that calls on us to be strong and self-controlled. And you learn self-control and emotional self-regulation through the stories you are taught as a child. I am so incredibly proud of Quinn for taking on this parsha that when I was your age was skipped. It is one of the most difficult texts in the Torah, a list of skin diseases and quarantine instructions and icky stuff that people do not want to read, but indeed we have to. And because you've taken this on at this age, I believe that you have a future ahead of you as a leader among the people of Israel. Quinn, may you grow in strength, learning, kindness, compassion, and empathy. May you be a blessing to your family and those around you. And I wish you and all of you assembled here today a Shabbat Shalom.